Get started here. Okay, so our first question for this evening is, what are the journals for high school students to publish papers? Okay, so that's actually a really good question because it's not actually that easy to get a paper published. I do want to warn everybody that there are a lot of, let's just say, less than ethical journal companies that are out there who are just trying to get the fees. In fact, you could probably look it up. The term for these are called predatory journals. It's basically like scams, right? So they try to have people submit things to them, and yes, they'll publish it, but they're not really very reputable. So it doesn't really help you, right? If you wanted some examples of more reputable journals, like some of our students have published in before, there's something called the Journal of Emerging Investigators, which is usually pretty good for STEM students because it prioritizes more like original research, right? For humanities like history, for instance, something called the Concord Review is very, very reputable because they only accept about 5% of the submitted journals. It's kind of like colleges too, right? You do want journals that'll be a little bit more selective, that won't accept just every paper that's submitted to them, because that's kind of the way you want to think of colleges, right? So the more selective a college is, the more worthwhile it would be in terms of your education over there. So you don't want to pick journals that'll accept just about every entry. Okay, so that's usually a good rule of thumb to follow. Okay, next is if a student targets schools that are ranked around 50 to 100, should students still do some research projects? It is a possibility, I would say, if the opportunity presents itself. But usually, if a student's targeting schools in that 50 to 100 range, there are probably things that might impact their application more. I would say maybe looking into college level courses would be good because then they have a chance to maybe boost up their GPA a little bit more, which if they're looking at that range of 50 to 100, it's probably because they don't necessarily have straight A's, right? Or they could continue to prepare for SAT or ACT, given now that there's a little bit of a trend towards more colleges requiring the SAT again. So I would say those would be first considerations. Usually the students that we recommend for doing things like research, especially during the summer, are students who are already probably, who have straight A's or very close to it, and also have their testing in order already, in which case they should use the summer to sort of strengthen their extracurricular profile. But if, let's say, for example, their GPA isn't all that great, a research opportunity isn't necessarily going to be all that helpful. For one, because if their grades weren't all that great, their test scores weren't all that great, then it sort of begs the question of like, how competitive is that research really? Because most research programs tend to be very selective, right? So that's something you have to keep in mind as well. Okay. But yes, if they have everything else in order and if they can juggle both a college class and maybe do a research project with a mentor, I think it could help. It's just that, there might be an opportunity cost to do things that might help your application more. Okay. Next is my child has gotten a 36 on the ACT in June. Great, congratulations. Should they take the ACT or the SAT in August? No, not at all, right? They should be done, right? There's no reason to take an SAT if they already have a 36 on the ACT, right? So congratulations. Next is the student will enter 12th grade this fall. He should be more confident applying to Ivy League schools, but he still wants to try for, I guess, category one. For example, MIT. Is there any strategy? In addition, student only does research with university professors. Okay. And professors cannot guarantee publication. Are there any remedies? Okay. To be honest, it's hard for me to give you a specific context in terms of if they're eligible for MIT, especially if the research that they're doing might not necessarily end up getting publication, because MIT is very big on like tangible evidence of a student's work originality, especially in the STEM field. MIT, for example, encourages students to submit something called the Maker portfolio, which normally is evidence of the student's work within the STEM field. So it's really tough to be able to kind of like assess, given that we're not sure about the rest of their profile. I would say if they're mostly doing research, then it needs to be something where they can demonstrate that it's high quality, high caliber research. Okay. Also, if they're only mainly doing research, it's going to be a little harder to stand out in terms of MIT's pool because, for one, a lot of top students are gearing towards having research profiles and research papers and stuff. So, that's definitely something where if you have some time to really try to see if you can get it published, a strong recommendation letter from those professors would obviously also help. But, I would say it's worth a try. It's definitely worth applying. I'm not saying you should not apply, but I would say, given the time frame that you have left, if their main activity and almost only activity is research, they would probably want to diversify that by having things like, volunteering would be a good thing to complement that. Um, Given the time frame that they have, I think they could probably do some sort of like volunteer project or a unique passion project. There's still time to be able to put that together before they apply to colleges, just to sort of strengthen their overall profile if they would want to be competitive for those top flight Ivy League schools. Okay, but like I said, barring more information, it's hard for me to actually make an accurate assessment of that with just that. Okay, I do have time for some more questions. So if you want to add a couple more, please feel free to do so. Okay, yeah. So these days, you also want to be very selective in terms of research because there are a lot of companies these days that simply say like, oh, we'll pair you up with someone, and they don't necessarily have very high stringent requirements to select which students will get those research opportunities. So just be very cautious, right? Just having something that just counts as research. There's some companies, for instance, that will have students do almost no work, and the person is just hired to do a publication. So it's very important that if you are going to go the research route, to show evidence of the student's work, to have a strong recommendation letter where the professor can really assess the student's abilities and skills, right? So, many of the opportunities that like we'd recommend our students, that's definitely something that we would highly advise. Okay, so can you tell me the name of the STEM journal again? Yeah, sure. It was called the Journal of Emerging Investigators. That's just one example of one that would be a pretty reputable journal. Oftentimes, if a student does research for at a university, for example, right, for like a selective research program, those universities will often have their own um, program specifically for it. Okay. Next is, do STEM students need to take AP biology? I don't know about need. It depends on what type of STEM. If they're more natural sciences STEM, it would make more sense for them to have AP biology if they're thinking of maybe something like, going into like pre-med, for example, right? But typically, if they're going to go for like engineering or computer science, it's not as needed, especially if, let's say, for example, you're worried about the fact that it's hard to get an A at a certain high school for AP biology, right? You don't need to have all three of the core principal sciences these days. Most schools would like to see two out of the three. So if you had chem and physics, you're okay. Okay, last is, what is NYU's ranking in computer science? Don't know off the top of my head, but it's generally not considered one of the strengths of NYU. So I'd say the core competencies of NYU are largely for fields like social sciences and business. Their engineering program's not too bad, but I would just say, like, in general, NYU's Tandon School of Engineering was a later addition to NYU's offerings, right? It used to be that Tandon was a separate sort of college apart from NYU. So when they added it, eventually over time it is getting stronger, but relative to NYU strengths in other fields, engineering is a little bit further behind, and I would imagine that CS would also be part of Tandon overall. So it's still a great school overall. If you value certain opportunities, for instance, like having internships or connections and not necessarily the pure academic ranking for computer science, there's tremendous value in going to schools in New York and Los Angeles, for example, because then you can get internships for like a lot of top companies. I think that could be something where if you see value in that above and beyond just the pure ranking, NYU could still be a pretty solid option for computer science. I mean, especially because it's often not as commonly applied to for computer science as well. Okay. All right. So I guess, yeah, that's pretty much it for this evening. Thank you for joining us. And yeah, I'll see you again next week for more Q&A.